Today's lecture, I'm going to be talking about, of course, the history of Russia, which we haven't really talked about. We've talked about some of these other absolute states that were big in Europe overall. So I'm going to cover from I'm going to start with medieval times a little bit, and then I'll get up to the main part, of course, talking about the Romanov dynasty, which is really the most famous that we have, overall. Kind of get into today and talk about the background of Russia. Russia started, like I said, in the Middle Ages. Really big, almost like the early Middle Ages, roughly close to about the 9th century is about when they think it got started overall. I'll expand this for you, but the Russian history, it goes back a long way. Overall, you can see the famous double-headed eagle, which the Russian state used, which kind of is, they think, related back to the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire. That's where that came from, and they think that Russia was first settled by actually Vikings that came in from Scandinavia. That the local Slavic people in Russia called them the Rus. That's what they call it, R-U-S, Rus. So hence the name Russia, which I think kind of meant the land of the Rus overall. But these Vikings weren't called the Rus. They called themselves the Varangians. It sounds like something from Star Trek, or something like that, like one of those old Star Trek episodes. But so that's who the Rus were. So they started selling Russia. Over time, the Vikings and the Slavic people kind of merge as one people. And all that. And I don't know if you know much about Russia, but Russia itself started not in Russia mostly today, but in what they call the Ukraine, which is kind of on the western side of Russia now today. Of course, it used to be part of Russia in the Soviet Union up to like the end of the Cold War. Kiev, if you study about it, was one of the first major cities that the Vikings, I guess, kind of helped settle in Russia. And a lot of the early rulers ruled from Kiev and a few other cities that were throughout Russia at the time. Why did the Vikings, by the way, go into Russia? Because of the trade routes. They were trying to get to Asia, like the Orient. And then also they were trying to link up with the Byzantine Empire, which was in the Black Sea and all that. So Vikings used their long ships to sail down a lot of the rivers of Russia, like the Don, the Dnieper, the Volga rivers. They even got into the Black and Aral Seas, I think they're called, also as well. And that's why they called them the Rus, because I don't know if you know much about the term Rus. Supposedly it was a term that meant to row, like to row a ship, because of the Viking longships. And so that's where the term came from. I guess they call them the rowers because they saw them rowing these ships more or less overall. Now, Russia had some early rulers they always talk about in their history in medieval times. One of the first main rulers they had was a ruler named Rurik. He was some kind of prince who was descended from the Vikings. They think he lived in the 9th century is when he lived. He was they called him the founder of Novgorod. It was a city that was founded in the western part of Russia. And he was like the ruler of it at one point. And he and his, I think it was his brother, Oleg. I think Oleg of Novgorod was the other ruler that ruled later, was the second ruler. And both of them ruled as like a prince or grand prince. A lot of the early rulers of the Rus, which was called the Rurik dynasty, later they dubbed it, were basically either princes or dukes, I think was the common name that they actually were called. But the term like a king or czar isn't really used, of course, until later. They also had another ruler you may have heard of named Vladimir, usually Vladimir, how they say it sometimes in Russia. Vladimir the first, or usually the great, usually Saint Vladimir. He's also in the Orthodox Church. He lived around 1000 CE, and he's considered to be one of their first great rulers that they have of Russia overall. He's very important. He's the one that pretty much converted the Russians to Christianity, which they decided that Orthodox Christianity, which was influenced by the Byzantine Empire, was the main religion that they would decide on. I think before that they were like pagan. I think, like, I guess worshiping some of those old Viking gods, and so he was able to get them to everybody to convert to it. And then they think that the Byzantine Empire had a major influence on Russia. It influenced not just the religion, but the language, like the language of Russia, which is called Cyrillic, is of course based off of the Greek language, of course used by the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire. A lot of their culture, a lot of their architecture, like a lot of the buildings, like seeing those onion-shaped domes on the St. Basil's Cathedral and all that. So it had heavy influence. And so Moscow later, about the, I guess going up to about the 15th, 16th century, starts to kind of come this like third Rome that they sometimes talk about, of course, later. However, Russia went through kind of a frightful period. I don't know if you know about the 13th and also into the 14th century. Russia was invaded by the Mongols. The Mongols came in because of Genghis Khan. You know that Genghis Khan, he formed the Mongol Empire in the early 13th century. And the Mongols conquered like China all the way into like parts of Russia in Eastern Europe, reaching, I think, as far as, I want to say, the Poland and the Ukraine. They got pretty far west. And as they went westward, they think they wiped out like half the population of Russia. It was like killed by the Mongols. And they think under Batu Khan. Batu Khan was the grandson of Genghis Khan. He formed what they call the Golden Horde Khanate, which the Golden Horde Khanate was like this Mongol vassal state that was in Russia. Some people call it the Golden Horde Empire. And it was ruled by the Mongols and their mercenary allies, which were called Tatars, which were like these Turks that they hired as mercenaries. And the Russians were forced to pay like gold tribute to the Mongols. I guess if they don't burn down their cities and all that. And so the term Golden Horde kind of evolved over time. Although it's been debated that they think that some of the Tatars lived in these goldish looking tents. And that's where the term Golden Horde came from, or something like that. That's kind of a frightful period. It's going to take a while for the Russians to get rid of the Mongols, push them out and all that over a couple centuries. But for like 2 or 3 centuries, the Mongols controlled Russia for quite a while. That's why you have like people that are Mongolian or Turkish that live in Russia, of course, because of that. Right, now I want to also get into and move on. I want to talk about some of the early czars of Russia that kind of come in, because you have a new period where you get the rise of the czars, where you get these rulers that are more like monarchs or kings that come in, which kind of come in about the 15th, 16th centuries overall. And one of the first they always talk about that comes in is Ivan III. Of course, later they called Ivan the Great. And Ivan III was important because he was the one that was instrumental in really trying to form Russia into an actual united state, which it really wasn't before that. It was more like a collection of states. The Kievan Rus states, I guess they called them, more or less. He also began expanding Russia, starts to kind of push them eastward, basically. He and his grandson, Ivan IV, of course, do that. He also would renovate the Kremlin in Moscow. And so from there, you get this deal where the czars start ruling from the Kremlin in Russia. And the Kremlin's kind of like the Russian White House, is what it is to us, would be. So that's where Vladimir Putin, reigns from, rules from in Russia as president of Russia. One thing about Ivan III, which is famous about him, he was one of the first rulers in Russia to start using the term czar, which they think was influenced by the Byzantine Empire, because you know about it, the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire used the title Caesar, which they think the term czar is a variation of that. I think it's more like a king, because later on they have, the term emperor being used, of course, later when Peter the Great comes in. But it was never an official title. So he was never coronated with the title czar, but he started using it. And I believe he married one of the, I want to say like a grand niece, some kind of niece of one of the last emperors of the Byzantine Empire. So he was trying to give some of this Byzantine blood, into his dynasty, the Rurik dynasty. And so he had this idea that Moscow ought to become like a third Rome over time. They think he's the one that adopted. I just showed you that, but the double-headed eagle, they think he's the one that started using it, which they think the Byzantine Empire had used it before. The reason why the double-headed eagle exists is because it represents like the fact that Russia rules over like the eastern part, like part of Asia, and then also the part of what is Europe. So Asia and Russia, Asia and Europe. So you got one head going one way and one head going the other, basically. Then they have his grandson. I'll kind of skip over his son. I think his son was named Vasily III. I don't think you have to know about him, but Ivan IV, known as the Terrible, of course, came in next. Of course, one of the greatest rulers of the early empire, of course, of Russia that you have. And Ivan IV was known as the first official czar of Russia. So he actually reigned from the 1530s up to 1584. So he's one of the longest reigning rulers in Russian history, over 50 years that he's in power. Grandson of Ivan III, Ivan the Great, that we talked about. Definitely the most absolute out of all the different Russian rulers. You can see he was kind of sadistic too. Like when he was a kid, he would torture animals, and even had some of the nobility or boyars killed if he didn't like them or something like that. Originally, he was Grand Duke of Russia, I think was his title. And then what happened was in 1547, that's when he became Tsar of Russia. And so the term they often use, I guess, for that, if you go back to this, is that they think he's the one that started what they call the Tsardom of Russia, where all the rulers are known as the Tsar of Russia, starting from 1547 up to 1721. And then Peter the Great started using the title Emperor of Russia, which all the czars are up to like Nicholas II, who abdicated in 1918. So that'll be later. What's the deal with the name? Like they call him the Terrible, which sounds like, he's a terrible guy, that kind of thing. But the term terrible in Russian, they called him Ivan Grozny, which Grozny meant more like formidable is what it meant. Ivan the Formidable. Or if you want to put other translations I've got up there, fearsome or awesome. And so it was a nickname that was supposed to strike fear in his enemies. He's a scary guy. You don't want to mess with this guy, the ruler of Russia. And there was actually a saying about Ivan IV, which might be made up, but they said that there's a legend that when he was born with two teeth. One tooth to devour his enemies and the other tooth to devour his own people. That's crazy. So anyway, he is famous, as you know, for constructing a very famous cathedral in Russia, which of course is called St. Basil's Cathedral, which you've heard of, which by the way commemorated his military victories he was kind of known for. I don't know if you know about it, but Ivan IV was one of the first czars to conquer part of Siberia, like east of the Urals, where Siberia is. And so he built St. Basil's Cathedral, to honor that victory overall. So he famously built that. during his reign. I think it was completed in 1561. You want to know the year of when he completed it. Yeah, he conquered like these two areas, Kazan. You may have heard of Siber, which is where they get the term Siberia from. And these were areas where the Mongols had controlled at one point in kind of like central Russia. And so from there, he's going to start expanding the Russian territory eastward until they get to the Pacific over time, which the Russians will, of course, later. Peter is notorious for committing genocide. They always talk about this. He's kind of like Ivan IV the Terrible is kind of like the Stalin of the czars of Russia, which is true about that. And he had this, it's kind of like a secret police force, which Russia's known for years, up through the czars and Soviet Union, which was called the Oprichniki. And it was a police force of kind of like a secret police of about maybe close to about 6,000 men that were in it. And they dress in these uniforms that look like monks, really strange. And they would ride around on horses. And they would put skulls on their horses. And they would actually carry brooms with them because they were kind of sweeping away enemies of the state, basically. And they were often called the czar's dogs. It was kind of a nickname that they were called. And it was something he was kind of notorious for. And they cracked down on anybody that was considered like an enemy of the state. And Ivan was kind of paranoid that there were enemies everywhere, not just in the nobility, but in the peasants and so on. And the peak of his genocide came in 1570 with the so-called Novgorod massacre, just kind of in Western Russia. It's kind of like between St. Petersburg and Moscow, Novgorod. And they're not sure how many people he killed. The Oprichniki probably was behind it pretty much. But they think it's anywhere from like 3,000 to maybe, they say 60,000 may have been killed, but that's just probably a ridiculous amount. But at least 3,000 to maybe 30,000 may have been killed in this massacre. Why did they do that? Because I think Novgorod was kind of an independent state at one point before that. They'd kind of become under his domain. And so it was kind of him trying to control all of Russia. So, but what happens later, the Rurik dynasty would decline. Like if you study about in the late 16th century, by the time he died, part of why it declined was because of the fact that Ivan killed his main heir. His main son, his oldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, he had gotten a quarrel with him, which I think had something to do with his Ivan Ivanovich's wife. He didn't like the way she was dressed or something like that. And he got mad at him in an argument. He struck him with his staff, which you can see he's got in his hand right here in that picture, Ivan or Ivan IV. And so he killed his son. And so after that, he didn't have any good heirs after that. And so what happened was Russia went through a period afterwards, which you may have heard of, which is often called, I don't think I've got it on the screen, but it's usually called the time of troubles that they have. The time of troubles. And it's a period of anarchy in Russia where basically you have these non-Rurik czars that ruled the state. I think many of them were descended from like the boyars, which were the Russian nobility. And I think the last Rurik czar died in 1598, which was Fyodor I. He was one of the last ones. And they had this guy named Boris Godunov that reigned. He was like a non-Rurik czar, who was really just a consul that was under Fyodor I. And they even had a case where they had these false Dimitris that tried to reign. I don't know if you heard about this, which was kind of crazy, but they had these deals where they had these men that claimed that they were the dead son of Ivan IV named Dmitri, who had died in 1591 or something like that. I think there's like 3 of them that were running around calling themselves Dmitri, trying to reign or something like that. It was a bad time. They had like the bubonic plague broke out and killed a lot of people in Russia. So horrible time period in Russian history. I guess at the end of the Middle Ages and all that. What happened was eventually you had the Romanov dynasty come in. You can see there, which would reign until 1917. They would take power, and they were related to this czar, of course, that would be Michael the First. They called him Michael Romanov. And Michael Romanov was related through Ivan the Fourth. He was actually a grandnephew through Ivan the Fourth's wife named Anastasia. So he would seize power. I think he was like living in a monastery, and they found him and brought him out. And the boyars elected him as the Tsar of Russia. And he wasn't really that powerful at first when he reigned. And then you can see here, Alexis came in. Alexis the First, Alexis Romanov, he would come in, and he was really the one that kind of would establish the Romanovs as an absolute dynasty in Russia. So he kind of restores that since Ivan's time. And so pretty much the Romanov dynasty is going to be an absolute dynasty that will control Russia for many years, of course, to come overall. Let me get into of course, the ones that are more famous in Russian history, because there's a few other czars after that, of course, after he dies also as well that we have. Of course, the most famous czar that you have, of course, in Russia is Peter the Great, also called Peter the First. So you can see reign 1680s up to about 1725 overall. Actually, he reigned before that. I think he goes back further. I think his main reign is really a sole ruler, like as by himself. He reigned from 1696 to 1725. But Peter the Great is known for modernizing, westernizing Russia and making them into a world power. That's pretty much what he's known for. I think pretty much he and Catherine the Great are considered probably the two greatest rulers of the Russian Empire from a long time ago. But he not at first. You know about Peter, he actually co-ruled with his brother, Ivan V, who was kind of incompetent and kind of handicapped. And so he kind of sat on the throne with him. They actually had a sister named Sophia who had all the real power. I think there's a story how they had this throne set up with a kind of a hole in it in the back of the chair, and she would basically tell them what to say when they were like real young. And so at first he didn't really have a whole lot of power until probably pretty much he got rid of his sister, and after Ivan died, that's when he basically took real control of Russia overall. Later, not now, but like in the 1720s, one thing that Peter's famous for, he's the first emperor of Russia. He used that new title starting in 1721. And so all the rulers of Russia aren't just czar. They're either called emperor or empress of Russia, pretty much up to 1918 when Nicholas II abdicated his throne. Now, as you know, Peter was known for his reforms, like reforming Russia, trying to westernize it. And one of the things that Peter did, which was very famous, he was the first Russian ruler to leave his country and go visit other countries, which you see today, like Vladimir Putin will go visit countries and discuss different things with other states. So he was one of the first to actually do that as an actual ruler. Why did he do this? Well, he wanted to go to the West to improve the Russian state, try to make it more like a westernized state like France and Germany and England. He also wanted to know more about the Western military navies that they had because he wanted to modernize their military. Also, I think he also went to the West to try to get military aid to fight the Ottoman Empire, which was kind of dominant in the Black Sea because Peter wanted to somehow get a warm seaport also, which they didn't have at the time. Russia was kind of landlocked prior to this overall. So he came back from the West, and so he started kind of trying to modernize the state. I've got a few things he kind of did that's kind of well known. Peter the Great, that you probably heard about. One thing he did was he changed the dress of all the men and the women. They had to dress more like they did in Europe overall. So that's one thing he did. One thing that was very, very famous, which is very well known, that you may have heard about, was he made all the men shave all their beards off, because in Europe, they shaved their faces. Maybe they had a mustache or something like that. And if you wanted to actually keep your beard, you had to pay a tax. They call it a beard tax. And they actually had to have like a little token you had to carry with you that you had paid it. If you didn't, they'd come and cut your beard off, which you can see in that picture there. There's Peter cutting people's beards off, but he probably had somebody do it for him. When he went to a bunch of countries, by the way, in the West, he went to Poland, he went to Germany, where the Holy Roman Empire is. Like he saw Leopold, Emperor Leopold. He met later Louis XIV too. He went to England, he went to the Netherlands, and when he was in England, he discovered about the potato. In Britain, Scotland, Ireland, they're kind of starting to grow potatoes, and so he brought the potato back with him, and so that became like a big staple crop in Russia later because of that. Peter was known for increasing serfdom in Russia. As other countries were getting rid of serfdom, Russia started increasing serfdom to grow crops like potatoes and so on overall. He did introduce the Julian calendar, which is like a type of leap calendar, which Russia did not have, which I think they were still using the old Byzantine Empire's calendar, which was different. And so he did that. He also brought in some art, culture, industries, newspapers, things like that were all brought in also as well. Of course, the big thing that Peter did, which is well known, is he modernized the Russian military. That's something big he did. He brought in military advisors from Europe. Various generals were brought in to train his forces. They got modernized muskets, cannon, things like that. In fact, there was a guy named from Scotland he brought in named Peter Gordon, who trained some of his military. And then he founded the Russian Navy, they think, in 1696. So Peter's the founder of the Russian Navy today. Now, the only thing he had a problem with, of course, Peter, was, like I said, Russia did not have a warm seaport. It was a major issue that he had to deal with when he was king. And there was two outlets he could take, Black Sea, or, of course, the other one, which, of course, is the Baltic Sea. The first thing he was involved in, if you know about this, he was involved in a series of wars against the Ottoman Empire. I think at least two campaigns. They were called the Azov campaign, 1695 and 96. Azov, I don't know if you heard about Azov, but it's this fortress city that's in the Sea of Azov, which is near the Black Sea. It's kind of like the northeastern part of the Black Sea. And so he actually built a naval force to try and take it. And he did. 1696, I think the second time, he was able to seize it. But he wasn't really able to get much into the Black Sea because the Turks controlled pretty much Constantinople, Istanbul, and so that wasn't really a good outlet, for later at that time. But later, what's going to happen up to the time of Catherine the Great, they'll seize control of the Crimean Peninsula from the Ottoman Empire, which is pretty vital. That's where they have their Black Sea Fleet later, the Russians. His most successful war was the Great Northern War, which took place in the early 1700s against the Swedish Empire, Sweden, which was becoming a major power at the time. They were reigned by this king named Charles XII. He was a kind of a military-style king. He was very young, by the way. I think when he started fighting them, he was like a teenager, like I want to say maybe 18 or something like that when he fought the Russians. And the Swedish Empire was massive. It controlled like most of Scandinavia, the area of Denmark, the Baltic states, Pomerania, which was like the eastern part of like where part of Prussia was. And then also they controlled like the northern part of Poland where Lithuania used to be. So, or I guess is now again. But this war was very important. It was, of course, Russia's first major European war. It's going to, of course, lead to why Russia becomes a major power overall. And Charles XII tried to invade Russia. But if you know about the Russians, started using like a scorched earth policy against the Swedes, which they would do in a lot of wars. And so 1709, Battle of Poltava, excuse me, was considered to really be Peter the Great's, first great victory that he has in a war. And that battle was important because it enabled the Russians to seize control of part of like the Baltic Sea and the Gulf of Finland, where later he's going to build, of course, St. Petersburg. Sweden will later drop out of that war. I think Charles XII dies in battle in 1718, and they would later sue for peace, like the Peace of Nystad, I think it was called later. Of course, one of the most famous things that happened after, of course, this was that Peter then used like some of that land that he seized from the Swedes to build his new capital, which later he'll, of course, have the Peterhof Palace built there overall. And this will lead to St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg became basically the new capital of Russia that we have overall for over 200 years. In fact, it's the capital of Russia from 1712 to 1918. And Peter wanted a westernized city, just like some of these European cities like Berlin, London, Paris, Vienna. That was the idea. He called it his window on the West. He wanted to use this city to try and trade with the European powers. And so starting, I think it was in early 1700s, he started building St. Petersburg, which was first constructed in 1703. It took him like almost 10 years to build it. I think over 100,000 workers built it. It was actually built out of a malaria swamp near the Gulf of, the Gulf of Finland, it was called. And numerous people died constructing it. I think they joked later that St. Petersburg was the city built on bones because of so many workers that died in the construction of it. He would go on to build a bunch of buildings there. Of course, you see there the famous Peterhof Palace was one of his, I guess, first things that he would build there, which was very famous. The Peterhof Palace was basically where his court would be, where he would rule from in the later part of his empire. And it was later called the Russian Versailles. And it was a Baroque style palace that was built with also parks and gardens. And I don't know if you remember that guy, what was his name? One of those guys that helped build it before was also involved. I think some of the architects that built Versailles also built that as well. And I think it was, which one was it? Louis, no, it was actually Andre Lenotre was involved in some of the parks and gardens and the water fountains that you see there that are constructed right there overall. He also built, I think I've got a picture of it too as well, the famous, where is it right here? Yeah, the Peter and Paul Fortress was something else that Peter the Great also built as well, which that was a citadel that he constructed because he thought the Swedes would come back and try to take back this land from him where St. Petersburg was. So he constructed it. It was named after Peter and Paul, in the Bible, like the New Testament. Not like Peterhof is not named after him. They call it named after St. Peter and all that. But it was built as mostly a fortress. And then over time, it was also used as a prison by a lot of the tsars would imprison people there. They also, I think the Soviet Union used it early on as a prison until like the 1920s. I think now it's a museum primarily. So I think they consider that to be one of the oldest buildings that were first built in St. Petersburg originally. Peter also had a son, too, that was supposed to reign. I don't know if you know this or not, but he basically killed him, too. His son, I forget the Tsarevich, I think his name was Peter Tsarevich. And he didn't want to be ruler. He didn't want to be the Tsar. And so he actually had him tortured and killed It's a crazy story about that. And so his wife reigned instead, who's Catherine II. She was the first female ruler of Russia that you have. And they also had a grandson, I think, that reigned named Peter the II that came later also as well. So let me go ahead and move on. Of course, I need to also talk about Catherine the Great. So we have her also as well. Of course, the other great ruler of Russia, second greatest one. Of course, the greatest female ruler that you have overall. Catherine the Great, as you know, was very famous, just like, Peter the Great. She continued a lot of the same policies that he did, trying to westernize the country, continuing all these different reforms that he was trying to do. Although some of her reforms were kind of kept short because of rebellion that broke out later in her reign overall. And a little background about Catherine the Great. She was actually more German than Russian, which is true about that. I don't know if she had much Russian blood in her. I think a little bit, but mostly German. Her name is not Catherine the Great or Catherine II. That's just the name that she would adopt when she would become the ruler. Her real name was Sophia Augusta of Anhalt-Zerbst, which is a state that was in Germany, I think northern Germany. So she was a German princess. And she was brought to Russia to marry basically this man named Charles Peter Ulrich, who was later called Peter III, who was also German. They were cousins of each other. They married in 1744. And the reason why this marriage happened was because the later ruler of Russia, her name was Empress Elizabeth. She was the last daughter of Peter the Great that would rule later. And she reigned from 1741 to 1762. She didn't have any children. So she had this nephew in Germany. She had, I guess he was half German, half Russian. And basically he came over from Germany and those two hooked up and married. And when she died, he became Tsar Peter III or Emperor Peter III. However, what happened was he was unpopular. The Russians hated his guts for a bunch of reasons. He may have been crazy or unstable, but the main reason they hated him was because he was a very pro-German. He liked the Germans, like the Prussians, more than the Russians. In fact, Peter III was an idol of Frederick the Great. Thought Frederick the Great was a great ruler. The problem was that Russia was fighting Prussia in the 7 Years' War at the time when all this was kind of going on. And so Prussia was their enemy, and so they felt like Peter was an enemy. And there are also bizarre stories about Peter that Catherine later told, that Peter was mentally unstable. He would torture animals. Like there was this one story where she walked into his bedchamber was. He was torturing a rat. And he told her, "This is the price for treason," or something like that. And they think he was also gay, Peter III. They're not even sure if Peter and Catherine consummated their marriage, like ever had sex or anything like that. And Catherine, I don't even know about the story about Catherine, but Catherine was considered a nymphomaniac. She liked sex a lot. And they think she may have had over 20 lovers, 21 or 22 lovers at one point, Catherine the Great. Peter was also unattractive. He had gotten smallpox, and his face was all scarred. And so that was another thing why I think she didn't really like him either. He was just unattractive, etc. So anyway, what happened was because of his unpopularity, like I said, Catherine in 1762 overthrew him, like in a coup. They think she kind of had an affair with the head of the palace guard and basically had him overthrown. And she seized power, and so she became known as Catherine the Great. 1762 to 1796, that she would reign, of course, over Russia. They called her Katharina, which is the Russian name, of course, the second. And she would, like I said, be known for a lot of her reforms that she would do to Russia. She would bring in a lot more art and culture to the country. She was deeply involved in the enlightened despot and she was a big fan of Denis Diderot. I don't know if you heard of Denis Diderot. He was a philosopher and French thinker who was the one that developed the first encyclopedias, like in France, the encyclopedia. And they corresponded back and forth. And Diderot even at one point came to visit Catherine the Great. And I think she even bought his whole entire library of books, which were thousands of books. And then she collected a lot of artwork, which was very famous. And that's the thing she's known for. It's very famous. She, of course, founded the State Hermitage Museum. And I do have a short little video I can show you on it about the Hermitage Museum. It's considered one of the greatest museums in the world, by the way. It has several million pieces of artwork that's actually there in the museum. So I have a little short video I'll show you real quick.
Russia's State Hermitage is one of the world's greatest art museums, with a collection numbering around 3 million works of art. The superb architectural ensemble of the museum buildings is situated in the very center of St. Petersburg and includes the Winter Palace, the former official residence of the Russian emperors, as well as the buildings of the small, large and new hermitages and the Hermitage Theatre. The Jordan staircase opens the way to the suite of state rooms in the Imperial residence. Grand processions would ascend it on their way to the large throne room. That hall, created in the austere neoclassical style, is striking for the grandeur of its architectural concept. At the far end, the throne of the Russian emperors stands on a raised dais. The small throne room has a commemorative function, being devoted to the memory of Peter the Great, the founder of St. Petersburg. The 1812 War Gallery was conceived by Emperor Alexander I to celebrate Russia's victory over Napoleon. Hanging on its walls are 332 portraits of generals who fought heroically in what became known as the Patriotic War. One of the most striking rooms in the museum is the Pavilion Hall, where the interior decoration combines Renaissance motifs with a Moresque style. A significant place in the museum display in the Winter Palace is occupied by the living apartments of the Imperial family, notably the Malachite Room, Golden Drawing Room, and Crimson Boudoir. These authentic interiors have survived down to the present day. The beginnings of the Hermitage's famous art collection were laid in 1764, when Empress Catherine II acquired 225 Western European paintings. That year is considered the date of the museum's foundation. One of the largest sections in the gallery consists of works of Italian art. The Hermitage is justly proud of its masterpieces by Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Titian, and other great names. It is also home to one of the world's finest collections of works by the brilliant 17th century Dutch artist Rembrandt. That includes some of the master's most significant creations. The collection of the great Flemish artist Peter Paul Rubens embraces all the periods of his career. The Hermitage can boast a fine collection of works of Roman art, spanning the period from the 1st century BC to the 4th century AD, and Italian sculpture of the 18th and early 19th centuries. The modern gallery opens with a constellation of brilliant French painters. Art lovers from around the world come to the Hermitage to view its masterpieces by the Impressionists, Monet, Renoir, and Post-Impressionists, Degas, Van Gogh, and Gauguin, and early works by Matisse and the father of Cubism, Pablo Picasso. The State Hermitage has become one of the symbols of St. Petersburg, and today it is simply impossible to imagine cultural life in Russia without this world-famous museum.
So anyway, that's, of course, the Hermitage we're talking about, which, by the way, is probably considered one of the greatest museums in the world. You can see there. So anyway, I need to talk, of course, a few more minutes on Catherine the Great, of course, his reign. Of course, a lot of her reforms didn't work out. She was known for, by the way, education for girls. Like there was the Smolny Institute you may have heard about, where a lot of the nobles, like daughters, were educated in Russia overall. But it was one thing that she wanted to abolish, which I think she was thinking about abolishing serfdom in Russia, because there was talk of that, of maybe creating more reforms, democracy in Russia, and so on. But what happened was they had the Pugachev rebellion break out in Russia, which, of course, had to be brutally suppressed. And the Pugachev rebellion was rebellion that was started, they think, in the Ukraine, kind of in the western part of Russia. It was led by this Cossack soldier named Emelian Pugachev. And so a lot of people joined it. Peasants got involved, like the serfs. I think even various Orthodox priests were involved as well, which would last like something like 2 years or so. And so she had to basically suppress it. And so she had to send out her armies and crush it. And so I think up to maybe like 10,000 people were basically killed, because it was like a challenge to her, power, controlling Russia at the time. And they had 10,000 may have been killed. And it's kind of debate how many it was actually, but they do think it kind of prevented serfdom from really getting abolished later, because serfdom will be around until like 1861. It won't be almost 100 years before, they get rid of it. So, the reforms didn't work out like she thought they would. And so later, a lot of the tsars, of course, will be pretty staunch absolutists overall. There was one more thing that she was known for in the end that's very famous. She was known for a lot of her expansionism, which is true about that. Under her, especially in the late 18th century, 1770s and 1790s, she expanded Russia quite a lot. Russia, by the way, will peak in size. One of the largest empires, of course, in the world. And some of the areas that she, of course, took over, about it, was she partitioned Poland, which she did like 3 times at one point, which Poland was kind of a state that kind of went defunct in the late 18th century. It kind of broke up, and it was carved up by Prussia, Russia, and Austria. And Russia took like more than half of it. Almost 60% of it was, I think, taken over by the Russians. They also took control of the Ukraine, which you can see on the bottom right here. The Ukraine was they took control of that in this area right here, like the southern Ukraine, Sea of Azov, Crimean Peninsula. They seized Crimea, which is right here. They took control of that, which will be important because that'll be like a naval base for the Russian Black Sea. And so that was very vital in taking over that. They also colonized Siberia, you can see. And then don't forget, under her, they started to colonize Alaska, like settling there, which is important, like the fur trade throughout that area. So Russia became a massive, massive empire that they had. I think they say that the Russian Empire will be the 3rd largest empire in history, behind the Mongol and the British empires. Mongols was in the Middle Ages, about the 13th, 14th century. The British Empire peaked about 1920. And you can see that their empire was almost 9 million square miles, or almost 23 million kilometers. That's a lot in size. I think it peaked, I want to say, in the 1890s. That's how large of when it was overall. But later, Russia is going to decline over time in the 19th century, but I'll get to it later. But Russia, I think its peak of this period of the Romanovs is going to be around the Napoleonic Wars, pretty much, when Catherine the Great's grandson, later Alexander I, Emperor Alexander I, will later defeat Napoleon when he invades Russia. And so Russia after that, it's kind of like peaks in power, pretty much. But Russia is going to decline after the Crimean War in the mid 19th century. And that'll kind of keep going until the late 19th century, which is later, because I'll get later into discussing more into modern Russian history, the 19th and 20th century, which I'll probably do that later in the semester overall. So that's pretty much it for my lectures, of course, on the age of absolutism. Remember, you do have some assignments that are still up. I know they have the Hernan Cortez video quiz. That's still up right now for you to complete. But don't forget, I did post a new assignment today, which, of course, is a Canvas quiz number 3 on the age of absolutism. That's going to be due, of course, next week. So that's pretty much it for today. I guess nobody has any questions right now or comments, pretty much. But if you have any comments, questions, of course, about this lecture, let me know later, and I can answer them, of course, for you. So y'all have a good weekend coming up. Don't forget Mardi Gras, of course, here next week, Monday, Tuesday. So no classes, pretty much. So next Thursday, I'm planning to review for our first exam. So I'm probably going to pretty much go over all the different study guide questions that I've got from all these different lectures. I'm going to kind of compile them all into one PowerPoint lecture, and I'll review over those. So that's it for today. Y'all have a good weekend coming up and a good Mardi Gras. So take care.